I'd like you to imagine that you and I have built this infrastructure in vSphere. And if you're looking at that and are thinking, hey, wait a sec, Keith, we have done that together. This is our lab topology up to this point. And to confess, you're absolutely right. This is the topology that we've built together in the hands-on lab up to this point. And I'd like you to imagine for a moment that this is actually now a production implementation and that our manager walks up to us and says, hey, we have a new person on staff. They're just coming up to speed with VMware and vSphere. Can you give them access so they can go ahead and start working with the environment? Now, the first reaction, at least for me, is, whoa, stop the truck. I don't want to give somebody who's brand new full access to our production environment. So, what do? Well, one solution is to point that new user to the Nugget Labs at cptnuggets.com, and they can practice everything in a safe environment and get comfortable in that lab environment before we turn them on to our production network. But even when we do give them access to our production network, we don't have to give them full access to everything. We actually have some cool tools regarding access control that we can implement that can help restrict the amount of damage and what the actual user can see in the environment. And the implementation of the access control inside of vCenter as we govern and manage our vSphere environment is done through permissions. And permissions have three basic elements, and here's what they are. First of all, we have a role. And a role is simply a set of one or more privileges, actions that can be taken. As examples, a couple actions could be something like being able to reset a virtual machine, or power on a virtual machine, or configure CD media for a virtual machine, or regarding a data store, allocate space. And those are all examples of privileges that could be associated with a role. So that's one piece. The next piece is what user or group is associated with that role that has those privileges. And for our example, let's say we have a user, and let's name that user Nuggin. So what we can do is we can associate Nuggin with a role, which is a set of privileges. And the third piece, to make this actually functional, is we need to associate the user or group with the role, which is the privileges, with a specific object or objects inside of our vCenter inventory. And once we do that, this user will have the ability to exercise those privileges that are associated with the role at that object inside of vCenter. So let's imagine that we want Nuggin, the user, to have administrator rights at cluster 2. Now there happens to be, fortunately, a role called administrator. So what we could do is we could go into this inventory, we could right click on cluster 2 and specify that we want the user named Nuggin to have the role called administrator associated with the object called cluster-2. And a really important aspect that we want to be aware of when making that decision is that when we assign a role to a user or a group at a specific object, there is inheritance. It's the trickle-down approach of rights management inside of vCenter, which means if we assign those permissions, which is the administrator role to Nuggin at the cluster 2, those would be inherited. That means Nuggin would have full permissions at VM1, to the vApp, to the resource pools, to the ESXi hosts, to our VM5, which is doing fault tolerance, and also our VMs that currently have some limits and reservations for CPU that we've all set up through our course together up to this point. So this, my friend, is the basic building blocks for access control in a vCenter environment. So what if we have Nuggin on board for a few months and we decide, you know what, Nuggin needs full access to everything. He's proven himself and we want to give him more permissions. Well, we could associate that user Nuggin with the role of administrator at the object up here of the vCenter, and that would indeed be inherited all the way down. However, there are other options. We also have options of global rights or global permissions. And the benefit of setting up global permissions is the fact that they apply everywhere. So if we put Nuggin into a group that was currently associated with global rights, or we explicitly went in and gave Nuggin global rights to everything in vCenter, that would apply to everything, including things like content libraries and all the inventory in vCenter and anything that we might add here in the future. It's sort of like a giant umbrella that says, give this person access. So whether it's explicitly assigned with global permissions for Nuggin, or we simply put Nuggin in a group that already has those global permissions, that's yet another way to assign rights in a vCenter environment with a very broad brush. Another challenge that comes up is, what about combinations? And with combinations, we want to be aware of the basic behavior of how it works. And then what we'll do in the lab is we'll do an example of one or two of them so you can see them in action. For the first combination, we'll take our user Nuggin, and let's imagine that we gave Nuggin the role of administrator associated with the object of cluster 2, so effectively Nuggin has King Kong rights right there. Everything at cluster 2 and below. Now, regarding a combination, what if we also came in and regarding VM5, it has a slightly darker VM icon because it's got fault tolerance applied to it. What if right here we associated the read-only role for the user Nuggin at VM5? Or, even worse yet, let's go ahead and change that to no access, which we can do. Now the question is, what happens regarding Nuggin regarding VM5? And here's what happens. Nuggin's rights, as they trickle down, are going to be overridden at this object, which basically means that any permissions that we assign at a higher level can be overridden by explicitly setting different permissions at a lower level object. And I'm going to fix my spelling for access there as well. Another interesting combination is group membership. So let's say for our permissions we have two groups, and let's call them Group A and Group B. And Nuggin is a member of both groups. And so for permissions regarding Group B, let's imagine that we've given some permissions regarding VM1. And regarding the roles for Group A, let's say we gave Group A the role of VM user. So the VM user role would have whatever privileges are associated with that role, which would include things like resetting a VM or powering on a VM or configuring the CD media. And then for Group B, if we assign the role of custom role, which we can create as well, and let's imagine that that custom role had some different privileges. Let's imagine specifically that that custom role had the privilege of modifying the network information for a VM. So the two roles have different privileges. They're both applied to VM1. Group A is associated with the VM user role. Group B is associated with the custom role. And the question is, what do you suppose for Nuggin, who's a member of both those groups, what do you suppose Nuggin's effective rights are, his effective permissions, if you will, at VM1? And the rules that are followed are this. When a user is a member of multiple groups, and those groups have permissions on the same object, in this case, VM1, the user actually gets the combination of the privileges associated with each of those roles at that object in the inventory. So whatever these two roles have, Nuggin, as a member of these two groups, would get all of them. And this is such a fun game. Let's do another combination. Let's imagine that Nuggin is a member of a group that's been assigned some permissions here as a group member to the object cluster 2 and different permissions as a user down to, let's say, VM3. And for the role, let's say it's admin up here. And for the user, let's imagine it's read-only at VM3. In this example, anything that's assigned at a lower level, more explicitly, is going to win. If he's a member of the group that has the admin role associated with him, he's going to have a party everywhere except for VM3, at which point he'll have read-only access. And that would also be true if we had the group with read-only permissions here as well. More explicit at a lower level is going to win. And one more combination while we're here is if we have a group and we have a user. So we'll say the user is Nuggin and Nuggin is a member of the group, and they've both been associated with some privileges via roles right at the same object. And in this example, the user assigned role is going to take precedence, and that's what the user is going to get. And not only will Nuggin have the privileges, whatever was associated with that user account right here, but that's also all he's going to inherit down through the rest of the cluster. Here on our Windows management computer, let's go ahead and make sure we have a Nuggin account in Active Directory so that we can actually use that Nuggin account inside of vCenter. So to do that, we'll click on this icon right here in the taskbar, and that is the icon for Server Manager in Windows. We'll give that a moment to initialize, and then from the Tools menu up here, we'll click on Tools, and from the drop-down, we'll select Active Directory Users and Computers. Let's maximize that window. And then let's expand nuggetlab.com, and we'll go down to Users, and then let's use a shortcut right here to go ahead and create a new user. So we'll click on the New User icon, and let's create a user account called Nuggin with a logon name as Nuggin. We'll click on Next. We'll specify that the password doesn't have to be changed and that it never expires, and then we'll put our lab password in here and confirm it as well. And we have a message saying, hey, you specified that the password should never expire. The user will not be required to change the password at next login. We'll click OK, and that's great for the lab environment, and click Next. There's a summary. We'll click on Finish, and there's our user account of Nuggin. Fantastic. So let's go ahead and minimize the Active Directory users and computers. We'll also minimize Server Manager. And then let's go ahead and double click on the icon for the vSphere web client to open that up. Occasionally, I get this message from Chrome indicating that we don't trust the vCenter server digital certificate because we are connecting via HTTPS. So we can click on Advanced and scroll down and simply click on Proceed to vcsa.nuggetlab.com anyway. And then after we do that, it seems to remember that for a while and won't prompt us every time. So for the username, we'll go ahead and log on as administrator at vsphere.local because we need to set up the permissions for Nuggin. And we'll supply our lab password and then click Login. And you know what? I intended to log on as administrator at nuggetlab.com, but I've been logging on so many times as the administrator at vsphere.local, it was kind of a force of habit. So let's log out. And I just want to verify, before we start working with the Nuggin account, I want to verify that our Active Directory integration via LDAP is still working. So let's go ahead and log on as administrator at nuggetlab.com. All right, so with administrator at nuggetlab.com in the username field and our lab password in the password field, let's click on Login. All right, much better, just for the purpose of making sure that the LDAP integration still is functioning. So currently logged in as administrator at nuggetlab.com. Let's hover over Home and then click on Home from the drop-down. From the Navigator pane, let's click on Administration. And here we have a list of our roles. Now all of these are coming free of charge, courtesy of the vCenter server appliance. If we wanted to create new and custom roles, we click on the plus symbol, give it a name, and then simply specify the individual privileges that we want associated with that role. If you don't need a new role, you can click on Cancel. If you want to look at what's in an existing role, we can click on the role. And then under Usage, it shows us where it's being applied. And everything we see here are the defaults. So with the administrator role still selected, if we click here on Privileges, it shows us the individual privileges associated with that role. If we expand every single object here, it's full permissions for every object. And to compare and contrast that, if we clicked on the No Cryptography Administrator, you'll notice up here for all privileges, it's no longer a check in the checkbox, it's a box half full. I guess that's the optimist perspective of privileges. But we could expand that as we scroll down and expand other items like host, for example, and inventory. We can see specifically with this role called No Cryptography Administrator that there are no permissions to add a host to the cluster or add a standalone host. And if we looked at another example here we have the virtual machine user, which regarding host, if we collapse that, has no rights to the ESXi host. However, if we go down to virtual machine for the virtual machine user, and we expand the interaction section here, it has an option to configure CD media on a virtual machine. If we scroll down, we can see the other privileges as well. So this role has the privilege of being able to power on or power off a virtual machine, or reset a virtual machine. So we can use the roles that have been provided for us, or we can create our own. And if we wanted to take a look at the global permissions, we could click on Global Permissions. And with global permissions, this is showing us that the group named Administrators has the administrator role, which is all privileges globally. It's also showing us that the user account of administrator, who is also a member of the administrators group, has also been assigned the administrator role globally. So if we wanted to add additional users or groups with global access, we'd go ahead and click on the plus symbol. On the right-hand side, we'd specify the role that we want to assign. So let's say we had the No Cryptography Administrator. So far we have two pieces of the puzzle. We have the where we're going to apply this, global. We have the role of No Cryptography Administrator, and that role has the associated privileges. And the last step would be to click Add, and add the user or group that we want to associate with that role, which would then allow that user or group that we specify to have those privileges associated with the role everywhere in vCenter. So if we wanted a domain user, we'd go ahead and click on nuggetlab.com, and then there's our user called Nuggin. We click on Add and click OK. So we don't want to give Nuggin global access. We want to limit him even more. So I'm not going to click on OK here to confirm that, but this is the process we'd follow to assign global permissions. So we'll click on Cancel here and Cancel here. So let's hover over the home icon and let's go directly to hosts and clusters by clicking that option in the drop-down. So let me go ahead and drag this over a little bit, make it a little bit bigger. So here with cluster 2 selected, if we click on the permissions tab regarding cluster 2, it's going to show us everything permission-wise associated with cluster-2. So here are the groups or users, here are the roles, and here's where they were initially applied. So 4 of these were all applied as global permissions that are being inherited everywhere in vSphere. And then this last one is the administrator account with the administrator role that was applied right there. And that's why it's being inherited down at cluster 2. So let's implement our plan. And the plan was to give Nuggin the administrator role right here at cluster 2. So to do that, with the cluster selected and the permissions tab selected, we'll simply click on the plus symbol to assign that role to that user at this object. So we'll click on Add Permission. We'll select the administrator role. We'll click on Add. Regarding the user, from the drop-down, we'll select nuggetlab.com. We'll go ahead and select Nuggin, click on Add, click OK. And then if everything is correct, and we'll verify our 3 elements, the object, the user, and the role that we're associating with that user regarding this object. And if that looks correct, which it does, we'll go ahead and click on OK. And now it's showing us that the Nugget Lab user of Nuggin has the administrator role that's been associated with this object, and Nuggin is inheriting those same privileges for everything below cluster 2, which includes the ESXi host and everything below. So if we were to go down to VM5, and we'll select VM5, and with VM5 selected, if we click on permissions regarding VM5, so Nuggin still has the privileges associated with the administrator role because they were defined at cluster 2, and he's inherited them down here at VM5. If we wanted to limit Nuggin's access to VM5, all we need to do is once again set up permissions for Nuggin and specifically set them up at VM5. So with VM5 selected and with the permissions tab selected, we'll click on the plus symbol. And for the role, let's go ahead and specify no access. And regarding the user, we'll click on Add, and we'll specify the domain of nuggetlab.com, and we'll specify Nuggin, click on Add, click OK. So then we can check our work. So we added the user of Nuggin as having the no access role on VM5. So with that in place, we'll click OK. And we can explicitly see that here too. So Nuggin, no access role on this object. And that looks fantastic. The only thing left to do is to verify that we actually get the results that we're looking for. And we can test that by logging in as the Nuggin user. So let's log off as the administrator. So we'll click on our name, and from the drop-down, click Log Out. And then we'll log in as Nuggin at nuggetlab.com. We'll supply our password and click Log In. And this is always the moment I'm thinking, oh, I hope that works. And it does. So we've already tested the LDAP integration. And because this is a new user, it's giving us the default layout for the vSphere web client. It's also indicating with the vcsa.nuggetlab.com selected, the vCenter, that you do not have permissions to view this object, or the object doesn't exist. So if we expand USA and we expand the Las Vegas data center, check this out. The only object that we have that we can see in the Las Vegas data center is cluster 2. So if we click on that, and I'm going to go ahead and minimize all the other peripheral stuff around the edges here, so we have more to see. I'm also going to click on the Help and remove the Getting Started pages. And then for the cluster, I like seeing the vSphere DRS, so I'll expand that. I like the little level there. And then we can expand cluster 2, and we should see virtually everything. And I say virtually everything because we're not seeing VM5. That's because the Nuggin user was associated with the role of no access at VM5, and for that reason, he can't even see it. Those more specific permissions overrode the permissions he was inheriting from the cluster level. And that, my friend, is an example of how we can set up permissions in a vSphere environment. So I would encourage you to practice in this hands-on lab environment that's safe. And if you want to practice setting up different combinations of permissions and then logging in as that user to verify the results, that's great. This is a beautiful, safe place for you to practice in the hands-on lab, and much better than trying out new combinations in a production environment. So have some fun with the lab, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.